Good morning, Peter Barrett. I was in the RAAF for about 22 years. I joined in 1974, went through on I think what was the last full Windjill course at Point Cook, then across to Pearce on the Mackie. After Pearce, I graduated, went to Iroquois, which we're now sitting in. After a conversion course at Fairburn, was posted to 9 Squadron, which was based at Amberley, just down the road. We're up at Oakey at the moment. And I'm sitting in an Iroquois 149, which was one of the 9 Squadron aircraft. It's been configured here in a gunship configuration. And I'll just quickly run through some of the equipment you can see here, which make it different from what we used to call a slick, which was the aircraft that didn't have the gunship's configuration. So working from the front, we've got a minigun, which was capable of firing about 6,000 rounds a minute, but it was downrated to I think around about 4,100 or 4,500 just to save a bit of ammunition. And it used to fire in 3-second bursts, so I think they would get about 20 3-second bursts out of it with the ammunition they had on board. And it was fed through this belt from 2 ammunition containers here in the cabin. Behind that is one of these on each side, by the way. There's a 7 tube, 2.75-inch folding fin rocket pod, which just fired unguided rockets at the targets. And they used to actually start firing at about 3,500, 3,000 feet out from the target and keep firing into about maybe 1,000 feet. And usually there'll be two aircraft, so you'd be firing, one would go break off and the other one would come in behind it. And the crewman who sits here had a twin mount M60 machine gun, so he could provide sort of suppressive fire as they broke off the engagement and keep the heads down of whoever was being on the receiving end of all this other ammunition. In the cockpit, and they're not fitted to this particular example, there were 2 fold-down reflector gun sights that ended up in front of each of the pilots. So when they were facing forward, you'd have one chap who was flying the aircraft and doing the firing, and the co-pilot was operating the radios and operating the armaments panel, which was on the centre pedestal in the front cockpit. Now it was a pretty basic sort of aiming system, and that's one of the reasons they used to get in pretty close, where it didn't really matter. You were so close that you could hardly miss. But the gunship program was actually developed by a chap called Brian Daru, who was an Australian. He ended up being a wing commander, or maybe even higher than that. And he started off with absolutely nothing, apart from a couple of old Bravo model Iroquois, which were a smaller version than this thing. And they went and scrounged all equipment from the Americans, swapping the equipment for slouch hats, beer, anything else they could do on the horse trading. And they developed gunships for the Australian Bravo models, which weren't really successful, and then onto the hotels as they came into service. And eventually got it all approved, but through the Australian government, which very quickly, in fact. But from what I understand, it's the sort of thing that was done in a wartime situation where it was done fairly quickly, but they received a lot of support from the engineering staff, both up in Vietnam and also back here in Australia, the logistics people. Well, look, in general terms, this is not really a second generation, but it's a later generation than the earlier Korean War vintage helicopters, the old Sioux, so people will be familiar with from MASH. It's much more powerful aircraft than the Sioux, and it's powered by a turbine engine as opposed to an internal combustion engine. It can carry a lot more people and equipment. Normally you would fly as a slick. You'd fly with 2 pilots, a crewman, and who'd operate in the back, and about 7 to 9 Army guys, reasonably fully equipped. One of the problems with the Iroquois is it's only got one engine, so being 1950s technology, the reliability of the engines wasn't terrific. And I mean, I flew Iroquois for 3 years and I had 3 engine failures. First one was on conversion course in the circuit, so that wasn't a problem. The instructor just took over and we landed. The second one was about a month and a half after I arrived at 9 Squadron, where we were taking off at maximum all-up weight to fly off to Melbourne, I think, from memory. And we had a short shaft failure. Now, a short shaft is the connection between the turbine engine and the transmission, and it delivers all the power into the transmission, which then drives the rotor up top. They used to fail every once in a while, and when they do, it's pretty immediate. So, but we'd just taken off, but managed to flop into a gap in the trees on the base at Amberley and didn't do any damage apart from spreading the skids. And they're designed to be spread on a heavy landing to absorb some of the impact, because the aircraft is not really crash worthy like the later models, helicopters like the Black Hawk, which was designed with more survivability features. When my third engine failure was in the Middle East, over the Mittler Pass, in an area where we thought was full of mines, but we managed to go into a sealed road and avoid the potential of landing in the sand with all the minefields. Problem with the helicopter is at low level and low speed, you don't have much energy, and they have this thing we used to refer to as the dead man's curve. And if you have an engine failure in certain areas of that, you either don't have time to react and you hit the ground, or you don't have enough energy to be able to flare the aircraft and do an auto rotation. If you've got enough height and or airspeed, one of the good things about a helicopter is you can do an auto rotation, which involves, instead of the engine delivering power and sucking, if you like, air through the rotor system, what happens in an auto rotation when the engine fails, the rotor keeps turning as you descend, and it's like a windmill effect. So the rotor maintains its energy, and as you get closer to the ground, you can flare the aircraft to stop the forward speed, pull up on the collective, which is the thing that controls the pitch of the rotors, and then with great dexterity, usually, rotate and then just cushion the aircraft onto the ground. So if you're over a treed area or a forested area, being in a helicopter is sometimes better than being in, say, a fixed-wing aircraft where you're going to go into the trees at 90 knots. You can just go in vertically. It doesn't always work that way, and there have been a few accidents where guys have been killed going into high trees, particularly in West Erie. There was a bad accident where the pilot was killed.
Is that something that you could practice?
We did all the time, actually, very regularly in the training world and in the operational world on helicopters, on any aircraft really in the military. You do monthly checks for emergencies, every couple of months for instrument flying. There's night flying, and then the instructors take you out and do these sort of checks and pull the engine on you at various places where you're not expecting it, just to see how you perform and to make sure you haven't forgotten anything. So, and that was one of the jobs I did later on in life when I was a QFI, or qualified flying instructor. In 9 Squadron, what we used to do, apart from supporting the Army quite a lot, was that in those days, which when we're talking mid-70s, there weren't a lot of particularly turbine-powered helicopters out in the civilian world. There were a couple of little jet rangers, but these were the days before they even had the Wales surf rescue choppers operating on the Gold Coast. So 9 Squadron at Amberley, 5 Squadron at Fairburn or Canberra in down south, were supporting the civil community in flood relief, bushfire relief, and search and rescue. And we used to have a constant search and rescue team on standby. And during the working day, say at the base, we'd have to get airborne within sort of a couple of minutes. After hours, you'd be called in. But we're always, not always, but very often involved in pulling people off mountains, or particularly around the scenic rim, around Amberley to the south. People that got lost bushwalking, pulling people off who'd been injured on boats or ships offshore. And in fact, I think I'd been at 9 Squadron for 10 days when I went on my first search and rescue as a co-pilot, where we took off from Amberley at night, flew to Brisbane, landed in Victoria Park near the hospital, picked up a trauma team and then flew them out to St George, where there'd been a pretty serious motor vehicle accident, and I think 10 or 12 people had very serious spinal and head injuries. And we actually came through Oakey to refuel, continued on to St George, but then had to wait for the next morning to then fly to Roma to get fuel, because there's no fuel at St George, and then back to Amberley from there. So that was a good introduction to 9 Squadron operations. A couple of months later, I was on another one from Townsville at night, where we had to go and pick someone up from Proserpine. And we knew the weather was pretty bad. We managed to get to Proserpine visually, which we always tried to do in an Iroquois. I'll talk about that in a minute. Picked up the civilian casualty, and then the weather was so bad that on the way back we were following the railway line at about 50 to 100 feet with the searchlights in lowering cloud, and then suddenly we ended up going into a bank of cloud within a bunch of hills just south of Townsville somewhere, and I had to apply full power and maximum rate climb to the minimum en route safety altitude. So that was a very quiet 30 seconds or so in the cabin. No one said anything until we broke out on top. Then of course we had the problem of getting back onto the ground at Townsville, and the old Iroquois only had a very basic instrument approach aids, which was just an NDB, which is sort of like a beacon that points to a needle in the cockpit that points to a beacon on the ground, and you fly overhead, then go out in one direction to descend a certain amount, then come back in. But because it's not very accurate, the minimum descent altitude is quite high. And at Townsville, with Castle Hill quite close, we couldn't get in. We tried 3 times, and we're still in cloud at the minimum descent altitude. And the flight service guys who were on the ground there, who were trying to help us as much as they could, they had one guy outside looking up, and he thought, I can see your searchlights, I can see your searchlights through the cloud. And we said, well, we can't do anything. We're just about ready to do a slow descent out over the water east of Townsville and come back, when I just saw a gap in the cloud, and we sort of dived down through that and landed before we ran out of fuel. So, look, it was always interesting, and there was always a lot happening. But I think that's probably one of the reasons I don't have much hair left, because of my time on this old girl. So, and I've got quite a few hours in this thing. I had a look at my logbook the other day. So we did a lot of support for the civilian community, and particularly when it came around to bushfires. And I think a lot of Queenslanders will certainly remember the 1974 floods when Iroquois from 9 Squadron were involved all over southeast Queensland, pulling people off roofs and off flooded terrain out west. I spent 3 years in 9 Squadron flying these things, and right at the end, I mean, there was some talk within the Army about getting 9 Squadron not providing the sort of support that the Army needed, and that was one of the reasons, I think, why the battlefield helicopters went to the Army. But 9 Squadron tried to do the best they could with the equipment they had. This is pretty basic, it doesn't have all the aids that a modern helicopter does. And towards the end of my time there, probably in mid-78, we started trying to work up a capability to be able to do covert troop moves at night, which meant night formation only as pairs, to make sure we didn't make it too unsafe. But these were the days before anything like night vision goggles or any other visual aids. So we were basically flying in formation at night with no lights or very low lights, with the pilot in, say, one aircraft, peering out through the windscreen, trying not to run into the other aircraft in front. And we were flying at 200 feet above ground to do these tactical troop moves, and then landing into pads out in the bush, which were only illuminated by one army guy on the ground holding up a siloam stick, which is a phosphorescent sort of light stick. And we were doing these approaches with no lights, no landing lights or searchlights. And towards the end of my time in 9th Squadron, we were in South Australia on an exercise near Port Augusta when I was involved in a very, very serious accident where the lead aircraft, and I was number two, we were returning back to the pad after doing a successful troop move at night. And the lead aircraft flew into the top of a ridge approaching the pad. We managed to clear the ridge by about 30 feet, and all 5 people on the lead aircraft were killed, which was pretty horrendous. So it was a difficult but very exciting and very challenging sort of operating environment in 9th Squadron in those days, and I think throughout most of the military. I was the captain of the aircraft. The co-pilot was flying, and as we approached the pad, I was aware that this hill was quite close to the pad that we were landing in, and I thought he might have stayed at sufficient height and done an overflight and then come in and approach from a clear direction. But but it was almost like he wasn't terribly aware that the hill was so close. And when he started to descend, I told my co-pilot to just hold back and stay high. And I was just literally transmitting a warning to the lead aircraft on one of the radios when they hit the hill. So I've always sort of carried a bit of guilt since then about, if I'd been able to get onto the radio a bit earlier, it probably wouldn't have happened. But you always sort of think that the other guy knows what he's doing. But that's one of the things you learn about military aviation. There's always something. Don't give, Anyway.
And the inherent risks of what you were trying to do.
Yeah. Look, it was. I don't want to make it sound too dramatic. It was a lot of fun. In fact, one of the reasons I went to 9th Squadron in the first place was on pilot's course. We were towards the end of pilot's course. Various instructors at Pierce would come in and give us a little brief on the aircraft that they had flown. And I do remember, without mentioning any names, but the young, he must have been a flying officer or maybe a flight lieutenant, came in and talked about 9th Squadron. And this chap went on to be a very high-ranking officer in the Air Force. But really nice guy, but he came in and talked about 9th Squadron. I don't remember too much about his description of what 9th Squadron did and the aircraft, but I just remember him summing up at the end by saying, so basically, helicopters, it's all about hooting and roaring and having a good time. And I thought, oh, right, that's me. So away I went, and so that became my first preference off pilot's course. So that's the sort of good stuff you remember.
They sold it well to you.
Yes, exactly. But look, it was a nice aircraft to fly when it did fly. And all the people who were in 9th Squadron, including the pilots, the crewmen, the maintenance guys, were a very close-knit team who really supported each other, and we did work well together, particularly when we were out in the bush working with the army.